Welcome to A State of Mind. This is Julian Royce. Today's episode is a fun one. It's a little bit different. I'm speaking with a poet who goes by the name Dank P.H.A.R.T, a pirate poet. I mentioned it briefly in the last episode on this podcast. He's also an expert in the beats and that literary movement, knows a lot about it. So he has a funny name, and at the beginning of our conversation, he explains his name, how it came to him. P.H.A.R.T is spelled P.H.A.R.T and stands for pretty hot and reasonably talented. So some humor there, and yeah, he shares some of his own poetry towards the end of our conversation if you're interested in that. And we talk about a lot of different topics. You know, we talk about the beats and their impact on this place, how they, Allen Ginsberg, who's considered kind of their leader, helped co-found Naropa University in 1974, where I went to school, which is here in Boulder, Colorado. One of the things we talk about is the beats leading to the hippie movement and the anti-war movement and some of the history of political activism in this country, and how I think it's just a massive mistake for the so-called left or people who are against a war or who are protesting something that our government is doing. I think it's a huge mistake for them to call themselves or to allow themselves to be called somehow anti-American. That, in fact, there's nothing more American than protesting, than voicing your dissent, than going against the mainstream. I mean, if we look at, our country from the very beginning, the American Revolution, our Constitution, the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. I think, someone like Walt Whitman, for example, is, I believe, a literary precursor to the beats, a beautiful writer and poet, and someone who was also very radical and outspoken in his own time. Someone who was against the war, the Civil War at that time, someone who was bisexual and spoke more openly about sexuality than was common then, is more taboo then than it is even now, and someone who had deep spiritual experiences. So Walt Whitman is a great, there's nothing more American than Walt Whitman, but there were probably people back in his time who were calling him un-American or whatever. And now, when we think about the hippies, for example, there's nothing more American than the hippies, than rock and roll. That is America. That's as much Americana as anything else, as a cowboy with a cowboy hat on. So anyway, we talk about some of that. We talk about the war on drugs and some of that history too. It was a great conversation. And we discussed a little bit Gary Snyder, who was considered part of the beats, but I think really transcended them. And he was the main character in the book The Dharma Bums by Jack Kerouac, which, maybe more than any other book helped introduce ideas of Buddhism and meditation to American popular consciousness back in the 50s, right, or early 60s, whenever that came out. I thought I would take advantage of this opportunity to read a poem by Gary Snyder here. I don't know if I've ever done this on the podcast, but why not? I want to take a chance, do something a little bit different. This is a poem called Rip Rap. Lay down these words before your mind like rocks, placed solid by hands, in choice of place set before the body of the mind, in space and time. Solidity of bark, leaf, or wall, rip-rap of things, cobble of Milky Way, strain planets. These poems, people, lost ponies with dragging saddles, rocky, sure-footed trails. The world's like an endless four-dimensional game of Go, ants and pebbles, in the thin loam, each rock a word. A creek-washed stone, granite, ingrained, with torment of fire and weight, crystal and sediment linked hot, all change in thoughts, as well as things. So that was Rip Rap by Gary Snyder. And now I think I'm going to take another chance and share some of my own poetic writings. I have shared some things I've written on the podcast in the past, but in any case, as I mentioned in this conversation, I was really into the beats back when I was like 19, 20, 21 years old, and I used to journal a lot, and I would write, and some of my writing would be inspired by them and their writing, but, that writing, if it still exists, is in some journals gathering dust somewhere. I don't have easy access to it at the moment, but something that one day I would like to do is go back through my old journals. So I'm going to share a poem that I wrote just a few years ago. I've got it here on my computer, so it's easy to find. And one of the things I loved about the beats and Kerouac was their stream of consciousness style of writing, and the idea of improv. And, when I've done music, I've always loved improv, making things up on the spot, not planning it, being spontaneous. And so that's what this writing is. It's something I wrote and had minimal editing afterwards, but it has much more of a rhyme scheme than things I would have written in the past. That was the stuff I wrote that was directly inspired by the beats. So I was listening to a lot of hip-hop at the time when I wrote this and trying to play more with rhyming. This is called Cannibal Secrets. Idle wild, fan blows smoke through eyelets, and chokes lazy day misfits and jades, lungfuls of ancient jokes that fade. Idols discover philosopher styles. We dream in between the seams, seems to be the same thing with different means, as if the light cast new shadows, and colors grew wings, flew like lazy arrows. While all the while, those without style, these folks spin too fast to choke on their overcoats, swim blue past the breaker's sound, these afternoons past smokes go round and round. Catch breeze and float these trees, appreciate all these busy bees, glad I'm not one, glad we are done, glad we stopped and learned how to be. Catch breeze, float through the trees, I appreciate and love all these busy bees, glad I'm not one, glad we are done, glad we stopped and learned how to be. Spark to believe it, this cannibal secret, gotta squeeze it and seize it and make it really happening, this money tree, from a sapling, to a giant of the seasons, majestic caressed it, this life spirit possessed it like a bikini in hidden apparel, blessed me with dancing, fuck being sterile, messed with my senses, confused me with her advances. I can never refuse, mistress goddess water flows when she speaks, your soul calls you forth to be so bold, to take a sip of her great secret, mistress lover bikini tip, meet it, defeat it, with surrender's profound secret. That's the key to this cannibal secret. Devour yourself to free your soul. Meet me in the motherland, be all personal control, and accept, accept, accept. So that was called Cannibal Secrets. And without further ado, I bring you Dank P.H.A.R.T, the pirate poet. I'm here today with Matty, who goes by the name
Dank P.H.A.R.T, the pirate poet. Yeah.
It's quite the name.
Yeah.
I remember when I first saw you, I was at an open mic thing, like at a bar, and you introduced yourself, and I was like, was that really your name? And then I was like, that's a bold name choice, and it made me think, you are not afraid to be you. You're not worried about what other people are. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's definitely part of why I hold the name. It was a name that was gifted to me. Oh. And so it was just part of the journey. But it was definitely the element that you're talking about was part of the reason why I held on to it. Because it was like, if I can hold that and push that out and be successful in the world with that, then it gives other people so much of such a far line in the sand that they feel like they have permission to be whatever they want to be. And so it was just, again, it was something that was gifted to me, but then it was just...
So how did it...
Well, it was 2009, probably around this time in 2009, it was October right now, 2021. Me and some friends were doing some LSD, and now what I'm calling a gonzo mystic naming ceremony.
Oh, wow.
Me and one of my new friends, me and her were talking about how funny it would be to be up on stage and just ripping massive farts into the microphone and just leaving everybody's mind just blown. What are these crazy people doing?
So your name does come from the more...
Yes.
Okay.
But then my friend on the other side of the room starts laughing really hard, he can't even breathe laughing. And we're like, what's so funny? And he goes, Bovard, which is my last name, you smoke so much pot, your farts smell like pot. I can smell them at my house all the way across town. And you're Dank P.H.A.R.T. And it stuck. And then they just started calling me Dank P.H.A.R.T.
Doesn't it have an acronym that...
Yeah. Well, it stands for P.H.A.R.T. It was originally F.A.R.T., but this is the name again. It was as the gift to me. The universe kept offering more nuggets of the gift. It was maybe about a year or so later, after I had moved out to Boulder, Colorado, that a friend introduced me to his roommate as Dank P.H.A.R.T, and his roommate said, "Is that fart with a PH?" And I said, "No, but it is now." And then it was initially pretty hot and really talented, but then at Arise 2019 at Rainbow Lightning's Children's Village, I was getting some food in the backstage, and a friend introduced me as Dank P.H.A.R.T, and he's like, "Oh yeah, this is my friend Dank P.H.A.R.T. It's P.H.A.R.T, pretty hot and reasonably talented, right?" And again, my answer was, yes, it is, actually.
It is not.
Yeah. So it's
pretty hot and reasonably talented, has a certain humbleness and catch to it. I like it.
Yeah, and it kind of just adds more to that shtick of kind of self-deprecation, but it's all in a good way. Yeah. And that also, for me, it was also felt like a kind of Merry Prankster type name. That's kind of over the top. And it tied into my use with psychedelia and psychedelics, which were always kind of my North Star in life with cannabis. And it was just like, oh wow, these things are not nearly what we've been told they are.
Oh,
and
well, we just jumped right into it here.
Yeah.
We got the backstory behind your name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it all just kind of definitely goes right into my lineage as an artist, which, is the Beats, into Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. And so it just felt like when the name just came in and was here it is.
Yeah, the trickster kind of archetype, right?
Yeah, 100%. And and it's just the universe gifted it to me, and apparently I have the strength to bear it.
Well, have you ever had a moment where you were like doubting your name, like, should I really be going by this name?
I haven't. Everyone else around me has. It was just like, it's not.
I love that.
It's not it is my choice. I could say no, but it felt like I needed to do it. Huh. And so then it was also, which I just had such an intuitive sense that this world was not in right relationship in so many ways. And so for me, living that in that way and having that name was kind of a middle finger to the status quo and being like, look what I could do, while completely disregarding all of the things that seem to be important and valuable in life, while also not negating any of that. Like, I've completed all of the checked boxes of what you should be successful in our current modern Western society, a college education. I've got a wife and kids and all of that. And it was,
congratulations on that, because that's a big deal.
Yeah, it was, again, that was something that just kind of happened, and it does tie into all of this other into the storyline in different ways, but that's like a pretty long story. But it does tie into.
Yeah, I'm picking up on, like, you just seem like someone who's surrendered to life rather than questioning and trying to figure everything out. It's just kind of like, I was given this name. I
is.
I have a family now.
That is definitely kind of how it's been, even though sometimes it doesn't feel like that. And it feels like I'm like with the family and the name, like that stuff was just like, here it is. Okay, cool. Here we go. And my wife, she was my girlfriend for a while, but we just connected, and she understood and supported me in me being me, and it was just like, all right, cool. Well, this is works, and it's just been a strange journey, and it definitely all ties into my work as an artist and the lineage of that I've been following for so long.
Right. What would you say that lineage is?
It's very clearly, for me, the Beats, Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg.
That's awesome. I like how you're using the word lineage.
Yeah.
And I think at this point that's totally fair with that. I mean, there's the whole Jack Kerouac school of poetics, right?
The Jack Kerouac school of disembodied poetics, and that was founded by Allen Ginsberg and Waldman, and that was probably like in the 80s into the 90s. And yeah, just as a way to bring Jack's work into life and writing and his passion for life and exploring also Buddhism.
Yeah, I mean, there's something in you that said yes to that when you... How did you discover the Beats? Like a lot of people, some people listening to this might not have even heard of the Beats.
Yeah, it was again just something that kind of came into fell into my awareness. It was I somewhere in middle school, high school, I had heard of them, but it didn't really click. I didn't know who they were. But then I graduated high school, and for some reason, Ken Kesey and Jack Kerouac and Tom Wolfe's Electrical Acid Test came into my presence all at the same time.
Oh, wow.
And I bought myself a copy of On the Road and Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but I got a copy of Electrical Acid Test from the public library. So I ended up finishing On the Road and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but I had to return Electrical Acid Test, so I never finished that book. And so I fell in love with Kerouac On the Road, and what I really fell in love with was the way that they were just so passionate about life and conversations and just really searching for the juiciness of experience. And On the Road, like really, if you really get to what they're doing, they're always like searching for it. They're like, is it this it, man? Oh, where is it? Is it it? And they'd be like stay up late night rapping. And it's this real ephemeral experience of it, and it's this youthful yearning and searching that's also just a calling out for life in the era that is, when On the Road took place, it was like 1946-ish.
Wow, really? That was in the 50s. Okay.
Well, it was published in 1956.
Okay.
But the experiences that he was having were like 46 to like probably like 55, and then by the time
so ahead of his time, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, which kind of was to say, like I guess you could say ahead of the time, but it kind of was an element of the time.
It was I think it would be fair to say it's ahead of the time in terms of the popular consciousness.
Yeah.
Like when that was actually happening, that was totally underground, not in the newspaper, not on the movies, right?
And if it would have been in the newspaper or the movies, they would have been calling him it would have been like essentially like a terrorist, right. Like a communist.
Blacklisted.
How dare you go be a freewheeling individual? You must go get a job and be a good citizen, and especially Ginsberg was a communist Jew.
And homosexual, right?
Yeah, I mean, he didn't really he knew he was homosexual, he was exploring his homosexuality, but it wasn't till like the mid-50s that he really was stepped into his queerness. Yeah, it was actually a psychologist, and he was doing like psychoanalytical therapy, psychoanalysis.
He was seeing a psychologist?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know
and
that.
And one day he was sitting there talking to his analyst, and he said, I am queer and I want to be a poet. I don't want to do any of this other stuff. And the analyst said, why don't you do that? And he's like, what? You mean I can do that? And then he just started doing it.
Wow. What a story. It's like discovering and claiming freedom that was always already here, right? In some sense, in America at least. I mean, they really pushed a lot of boundaries, but...
Yeah, and I mean, there really wasn't freedom. I mean, to be queer back then, you could... I mean, if in the South, you could be... you'd be a missing person.
Beaten up or killed.
Or all kind. Yeah.
Put in jail, maybe.
Yeah. And I mean, it wasn't strictly. I mean, there were probably some places where sodomy and things like that were strictly criminalized.
I think it's still illegal in Texas.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Like sodomy laws or whatever.
Yeah, there's so many weird laws on the books. The thing with laws is once they're on the books, it takes a lot to change them. And a lot of times they'll just we don't even remember it anymore, so they're not enforcing it.
Until they decide to pull it out.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating. It's it just makes me think World War II, obviously this incredible cataclysmic struggle that created the world order that to a large degree we still have today.
Yeah.
And then almost immediately there was this, the 1950s, it was a real conformity.
Yeah.
in America. It was a real, like, there's a lot of prosperity. There's a lot to be grateful for, but there was also a lot of social norms that were very strongly enforced and felt. And Kerouac was like this thing that shot out against, I mean, all the beats, they like went against that grain. And then that eventually snowballed into what, like the hippie movement? Like it kept going and going. And
Yeah.
we still have this kind of dynamic in our society today.
Yeah.
It's like still so relevant, I feel like.
And it's really been, I mean, beyond, before them, I mean, there was all kind of artist, creative culture has usually a tendency to do that. You could probably even look back in the Renaissance and there were similar elements of social conformity and then different artists that were breaking out. And there's different eras that are sometimes more open to it than others, where the 50s were like, and the late 40s, post-World War II, into the 50s were super conformity. So they were really not accepting of it, but they were living in an edge space. And so they were able to just work a little bit and pay whatever bills and find like the most cheap place to live because they weren't trying to play the rat race. And so you could just show up at a place and get a job and you show up, do the work, and you get paid. So it was not, didn't have all these difficult systems and hoops that you necessarily had to jump through. And then like, you're not doing the job, you just get fired and then you go do something else. And Kerouac was heavily supported by his mother.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So
he had some financial support.
Yeah, basically, not like a little bit. He'd leave for a long time, for a while, like, and then he'd be on the road doing little things here and there that would kind of support him. But then when he was a little bit desperate, he'd send for money, ask for it to his mom and get like $50 here and there. But then he'd go back and live with his mom for a long time and kind of write in his notebooks and his journals. And so he was like, he'd go out on adventures, do his thing, kind of take a lot of notes, and then he would come back and live with his mom. And then kind of write a lot, write. And he was just bent on being a writer. And he was
prolific writer, yeah.
Yeah.
Makes me think about, I mean, Kerouac, obviously, is so famous, so iconic, in that sense, so successful. There must be hundreds or thousands or however many of other artists who are also so driven and so prolific, but we never hear about them, right? Like,
yeah.
It makes me wonder, like, what it was about him that somehow like, caught the imagination.
Well, his dedication. I think a lot of it, him and Ginsberg, they all met in Columbia in like the early 40s at Columbia University. Burroughs was there and Kerouac and Ginsberg, and that's where they all met. And so they were all and Kerouac was really like, I'm going to be a successful writer. Like there was no other option for him. He was going to be a successful writer. And On the Road actually was his second book. His first book was titled Town and the City, and it was a much more traditional narrative. Still had some elements of semi-autobiography, and that never really took off, and he was not very happy with it. And it was after that book was published that he kind of started to find his own style and broke out of the old narratives, and because they all really studied a lot of literature and were very knowledgeable about the Western canon, because in that era there really wasn't much beyond the Western canon that you had access to.
That's a good point too.
Yeah, and then Ginsberg also was really driven
Wait a minute. Is it true? This is a story I heard. Is it true that Kerouac, he wrote On the Road, he was traveling all over the place, and then it wasn't published, and he carried it on like a giant roll? Someone told me it was on a giant roll of like toilet paper. Or just like a giant roll of paper that he carried in a suitcase for like 10 years. Or
he may have carried it in his suitcase, but he had all of his notes, so he was always taking notes in notebooks. And then when he finally wrote it, he had all of it like kind of in his brain and had been like kind of creating it. And then he was actually at his mom's house and he taped all of the scrolls together. And so it is one like
so there was a long scroll.
Yeah, pieces that he taped together, and then he took Benzedrine and got really high and just like and whatever else and just sat in the room and just went and just like freaked out for days. And I don't know exactly how long it took, but he did write on the scrolls. He'd get himself kind of in a drugged up frenzy.
Oh wow.
And just like, and so the actual book that is published as On the Road is not the actual manuscript on the page. It's on the scroll. It had some editing done to it and
a little
stuff.
bit of editing. Okay.
Yeah, and there was really wasn't.
It's a cool thing about the old typewriter, right? Like you're on a typewriter. You're not.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's no computers back then.
Yeah, and just the sound of the keys, and you're just going.
It has that feel, that stream of consciousness of just a nonstop.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, like he never takes a breath, just the whole thing kind of comes out.
Yeah, well, and it's also to really understand it, you have to, like, he was, like, writing to the rhythm of jazz. So when you hear him read it, you start to understand his rhythms, because they were listening to jazz all the time, and it heavily influenced the way that he was writing. Like, with Kerouac, it's just as much about the style as it is about the story. Sometimes even more. It's, like, even potentially more about the style and less about the story. And so that's what he was capturing within it.
I remember I read that, I must have been 17, 18, I don't know, and feeling kind of high just from reading it. Because of all that energy and enthusiasm and excitement. And then I learned more about his life. I used to be really into the Beats, so this was like a long time, it was in like, 1920. But that he became kind of an alcoholic, and then he became kind of conservative at the end of his life, and was kind of, there's some stories I read of him like basically like yelling at people, and like Ginsberg trying to like make peace, and he became this like crotchety old man kind of.
Yes, that's a
lot of people don't know that about Kerouac.
Yeah, and part of it was so by the time On the Road became published, he'd pretty much lived his life. The last 10 years from like I think How was actually published in 1956, which was Ginsberg's first book of poetry that exploded. And then On the Road was published in like 1957. So both these books came out and On the Road became an instant bestseller. But then by the time that book was published, the next decade was just him trying to figure out how to not be an alcoholic and drinking himself to death and living with his mom. And so like
Is that partly because of the fame? Like he couldn't deal with the fame?
That was part of it, but also how the media took him and made him saying what he was, because he was never a communist. So a lot of the ideals that were the more radical ideals were actually more Ginsberg's perspective. But the media didn't differentiate.
Because Ginsberg was a character in the book, right?
Yeah. And
so people would read On the Road and they would just attribute all those ideas to Kerouac, which wasn't fair.
Well, and also the media pinned, there was like the Beats, and they pinned Kerouac as the king of the Beats. And then all the things that were the Beats was like this random laundry list of things that Kerouac didn't necessarily feel aligned with.
Right.
And by the time he was
being pigeonholed.
Yeah, well, and he was also an alcoholic, so it just like it fed into it. So like he's feeling jaded and feeling attacked. And so and he's an alcoholic, and so it feeds deeper into the alcoholism, and so it becomes a self-defeating mechanism. And he also, there was a lot post World War II, so there's all this like trauma within life. And Kerouac's little brother died when he was like 4 or 5, and his brother was like 9, and he had this. It was the idea that his brother was like the good kid, and he was kind of just the fuck up. So he always had this kind of
carried that.
Yeah, throughout his whole life. And Ginsberg also, his mother had some severe mental issues, psychiatric mental issues, and she was seeing stuff like schizophrenic. And he was left with his mom when he was like 10 and 12. His dad still had to work, his brother would go to school, and he would just get left home with his mom, and she's kind of having like full on like psychotic episodes, and he's just like and he actually ended up when he was 12 signing, maybe he was a little bit older, but he was not very old, ended up signing the papers for his mom to get a lobotomy without quite realizing what he was doing.
Wow, I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
That's intense.
Yeah, so there was
he signed the papers for his mom. How old was he?
He was a teenager. He was not very old.
Mental health in the 50s was not what it is today. Yeah. And the lobotomy was done thousands of times.
Yeah, it happened at Ken Kesey's One Full of Cuckoo's Nest. That's like the high point is R.P. McMurphy getting a lobotomy.
Oh man, it's so terrible. It's a terrible history because I was reading some of the history of that. The guy, I can't remember the name, but some guy invented this procedure called the lobotomy, and he went around saying it's so quick and easy to do. He could do like a dozen in one day. So like one doctor could do a whole bunch like real quickly, and it's very efficient. And then the problem is solved. And then later people are realizing, wait a minute, the hell are we doing here?
Yeah. Yeah.
They had no idea about the brain, and it's just terrible.
Yeah. And
that being said, this is a little bit random, but electro shock therapy was also developed, and that's actually still used today, and actually does help people.
Okay.
And also has some negative side effects like memory loss.
Yeah.
So it's things like real schizophrenia and psychosis are very difficult to. There's no quote unquote cure. There's no silver bullet there, so it's tough, but.
Yeah, 100%. And, figuring out how we as a society, I believe that the solutions will come through creating space where if people are going through episodes or people have a tendency towards that, where you can create a safe space for them to fully explore and express whatever it is.
Be how they are.
Yeah, and my hypothesis is that if you can create that within that they're able to go into it enough in a safe space that whatever wants to come out might actually provide some answers and solutions for themselves and potentially humanity.
Interesting, yeah. It's a big subject, yeah,
because the biggest thing is, like, what happens is they're no longer able to be functional in society, and when they're no longer functional in society, they just become a weight, and we're like, oh, well, we have to spend all this money to support this person.
To caretake.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of, like, how do we...
There's a whole movement of people online who believe schizophrenia is actually like what people who became shamans would go through to some degree, and that there's wisdom there, and that we're mistreating them, and it's quite controversial.
I have a friend that's schizophrenic that believes that exact thing.
Okay, yeah. It's not... some people believe that, and I think there's probably some truth to it, but there's also a lot of suffering that causes, and that...
Yeah.
It's...
That's what I was trying to talk about. How can we create safe spaces and recognizing that someone's going through some sort of an episode that they need support in, right, but at the same time not just putting them in a ward and being like, you're just crazy and everything you're saying is invalid.
And just locking the door and it kind of, maybe to bring it back around to what we were talking about before, this idea of like neurodiversity.
Yeah.
Different people are wired differently, and that's okay, and that should be a part of the conversation around diversity and inclusion and equality, and that like people, can be different.
Yeah.
They don't have to fit into a box, or we don't have to be the same.
That's exactly what the Beats were all about, and that's what they were doing. They were just like, and Burroughs was like the one that was like,
he was really out there.
Yeah, Burroughs was the most out there. He was the one that got them to go like, all right guys, fuck it, we're going off the deep end, and they're Jack and Alan were like, all right. That's cool. And he was just a prolific speaker. And so he knew all of these classics. And so they were when they were in Columbia.
Well educated, right?
Yeah. Well, Columbia University is an Ivy League school.
Right.
Jack got there on a football scholarship, but they were all just extremely thirsty for information and knowledge, and they just devoured books and then talked about books. And so they would just what they would call rapping, and they would just talk for hours and
they would
hours.
Call it rapping. That's interesting.
Yeah. And they would just talk for hours and hours and hours, and that's what really intrigued me about them. It wasn't just like this party scene where they were going around drinking. There was something deeper into it. They were looking for something greater in life, and that was on the road. And then Dharma Bums is the sequel to to On the Road, and Dharma Bums for me really brings it all home. On the Road is this youthful seeking that's just like, oh my god, where is it? It's this ephemeral experience that's always moving, and you gotta have the most high intensity expression for it. And if it's not this intensity, then it must not be it. Yeah. And then Dharma Bums is this much more grounded journey, which introduces Gary Snyder and Dean. Well, and On the Road, the person that's really catalyzing a lot of the action is Dean Moriarty, but Neil, who's in real life Neil Cassidy. Yeah. And Neil Cassidy was just like fucking fireworks. There was no stopping him. He's just like on a tear, and anything in his way, he's just gonna bowl it over.
And he's Neil Cassidy's kind of the hero on the road, right? The kind of the main guy.
Yeah.
What happened to him at the end of his life? Do you know?
He died walking on next to some railroad tracks. He died of exposure. He was,
really?
Yeah, he was just it was like the late 60s.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so he was just literally walked himself to death.
Seems fitting somehow.
Yeah. And I believe there's a story of him, Bukowski meeting him right before he died.
Oh, wow.
And he tells Bukowski, like, hey, Kerouac wrote my life, and the journey's about my life. You're going to write about my death. And Bukowski's like, bullshit. And then, like, a day or so later, he was dead. And Bukowski's like, oh, I guess I am.
So would Bukowski be part of the Beats?
No, Bukowski, he probably would have been somewhat similar generationally, but Bukowski was just his own beast. He just was doing his own thing. He just
I read a little bit of him. I never got that into him.
Yeah,
He's a little more vulgar, right? Is that accurate?
Well, I mean, the beats were pretty vulgar.
Were they? Okay.
Yeah.
Ginsberg could be. Yeah.
Yeah, but Bukowski was just I think he was more Southern California too, but he was just his own unique expression of life. I've read more of his poetry than anything.
Well, the other one you just mentioned, Gary Snyder, before we started recording, we were talking about him being, I think you said he was one of your favorites. He's definitely someone I admire a lot, and to me, he never fit into the category of the Beats, like, with something more than that, or beyond that, because he like, really learned Japanese, and he translated, and was a serious student of Zen Buddhism. And a highlight of my life, honestly, I got to see him speak at Naropa University.
I think I was there too.
Yeah, it was so good, and like his presence and a certain like magical quality of and so grounded and so just
I think Ginsberg had some of that quality. Like
I never got to meet Ginsberg, obviously.
But he was a serious student. He was definitely a serious scholar in his own right. But yeah, Gary, I definitely feel was just as a human being, just like a really good person, and he was really like back to the Earth movement, like before it was a thing.
Right.
And so he was like one of the first people that was like, hey guys, like we need to reevaluate our relationship with the world.
Like he's someone who was walking the talk. What is it? Walking the talk.
Yeah.
You know, like moving off grid, like you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to align his life in such a way that it respected the whole Earth and the planet. And I heard that he was actually offered, or told by a Zen master, they were going to make him a Zen master. And he said he didn't want to do that. He was a poet, and he didn't want to take on that title, that responsibility. But he had a Zendo, I think, as part of his off-the-grid community.
Yeah, I believe, that is correct. So he was always, just very much, he went to Japan and studied very austerely Zen Buddhism on like the very practical level.
Traditional way.
And in Ginsberg, after Howl was published in 1956 and that exploded, he did spend a fair amount of time in India. From like the late 50s to early 60s, he spent probably about a 2 to 3 year period in India, kind of really getting into it and being in the process of the experience.
Nice, yeah. I've heard, it's coming back to me now, a story I heard about Ginsberg is, he went to India, and then he met Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who later founded Naropa University, when he was a young monk in India who just escaped from Tibet, and it didn't really click or register, it didn't have that much of an impact, but they met, and then years later he was hailing a cab in New York City, and there's some story like someone cut in front of him and got in the cab that he had just hailed, and as the door was like closing and turned around, it was Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and they like made eye contact, and he like later that became his teacher. But somehow and then later they realized they'd actually met in India like all those years before.
I think that's just like the synchronicities of these patterns that are in life because I've definitely been following strange patterns of synchronicity, and I think that is an actual way that this reality works, and being able to
synchronicity. I think I've started to think of synchronicity as like a sign that you're in your flow. You're being more spontaneous. You're not operating just on the level of like thinking a whole lot logically about everything. You like, you know.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that, and that actually would make a lot of sense because that was one thing that Ginsberg and Kerouac and all of those the beats they were into was improvisation, spontaneity, and being able to just
like on the moment.
Yeah, in the moment, and they would a lot of times Greggy Corso too. They would just spontaneously like spit poetry back and forth at each other. And just say like absurd things and like do like spontaneous haikus, and so there was a lot of improvisation and being in the moment, and that also comes what they were like trying to discover which was the presence within the moment, and what is this full experience of life that is so ephemeral and fleeting yet still here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it was really powerful times. And then when On the Road was published, it became pretty much an instant bestseller.
I didn't know that. That's amazing how big of an impact it had.
Yeah, and so then all of a sudden, like, the book sold. Kerouac got his mom, bought a house for his mom, and so like he was taking care of his mom, and so his mom was taking care of him.
Does his mom live in North Carolina?
At one point.
Because I grew up in North Carolina. I remember hearing that. Okay.
Yeah, I think she did, and but she also then lived in New York. His mom lived with his sister in North Carolina for a little bit,
okay.
And I think in Dharma Bums he goes to visit them at Christmas. And
okay, I think I remember something about that.
Yeah, and Neil Cassidy comes in and he's just like freaking out to jazz, and they're all like, "What is wrong with this person?"
I guess there's a lot of excess, right? It makes me think like the Dionysian elements, versus the Apollonian elements.
Yeah, it was definitely very excessive, and I think a lot of that came out of the repression of the 40s into the 50s, but also, I mean, it was just common practice to be an alcoholic back then.
That was like a norm.
Yeah, it was not. You had to be a really hardcore alcoholic to get in trouble for being an alcoholic back then.
Yeah. I think that's one way in which I think our society has progressed. I think that kind of drinking every day at lunch, at dinner, blah, 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 is less common, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. And also, and the amounts that they were drinking, it's definitely a very good thing.
My grandparents were of that generation, kind of, that was like normal for them. Whatever, the martini at lunch, the cocktail hour, the wine at dinner, like just like all the, so kind of European lifestyle.
Well, yeah, I mean, it might even be more American than, I feel like Europeans are a little bit more, I haven't been to Europe, but from what I understand, a little bit more, they drink, but they're not like drinking heavy amounts. Whereas I feel like in America, they have a tendency to drink heavier. I think America likes to consume heavily.
Yeah, that's probably a safe statement.
I mean, I'm guilty of it. It's definitely part of my journey as an artist and as a person was definitely being inspired by these individuals that were very excessive. And so it definitely colored my experience. Yeah.
And so you got inspired with these and you write your own poetry and writing and...
Yeah.
I mean, that's your main form of expression, right?
Yep, poetry, and it was definitely heavily inspired by them. And so how I discovered I was a poet, and so it was my freshman year in college, and I think it was the second semester, but it was a class called Interpretive Lit. It was just a general class about literature, and so you just go over all these general topics of literature, novels, whatever. And one of the subjects was poetry, and the teacher handed out a packet of quotes by like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Freud, Frost. Like it's like 2 pages of like all of these like epic heavy hitters of like the Western canon. And Freud's was like all of the dark places that I've been before. Poets been before. I think Fitzgerald was talking about like living life on fire, and it's just like you have to like put it out, like you can't not do it. And I was just reading through all these quotes, and I had been writing in my notebooks for a couple years, just like on my own terms, not really thinking about anything, and just writing. And as I was reading these quotes, it was like, oh my god, I'm a poet. That's what I do. And from that moment on, I just started calling myself a poet, and I had unread...
I like how you said you discovered that about yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was just like, it was like a lightning bolt. It was just like, shit, that's me. And I had read Kerouac, and I don't even know where it was in my consciousness, but the next thing I knew, I was buying myself Allen Ginsberg's Howl.
Oh, nice.
And I was like, and it was, and it must have been in there from the connection to Kerouac, but I don't recall, but it was just like, I need to buy this book, and it was this first book of poetry that I ever read. And then the first few lines, I've seen the best minds of my generation, starving, hysterical, naked. And it was just like, from those first lines, it was like, I was hooked. Yeah. And then discovering more about their life, I was like, oh my gosh, like I feel like really like aligned with these people and what they were doing, and I feel like everything that I'm doing is just an extension of the movement that was before that they were doing, and then realizing that
back to lineage again.
Yeah, exactly, and then understanding that they were also connected to a lot of the writing movement and the artistic movement that was happening before, and it wasn't just like out of nowhere, and so it was connected to it. And if you like look into the Western, from a Western perspective, if you continue to just like look back into Western culture and look at the art movements, they usually they grow off of each other, and we're now living at this time where all of this art movement that has happened throughout the Western culture is now kind of moving into now and opening up with more ability for full expression with the internet and everything. Like now we have really, Kerouac could actually self-publish his book as he wanted to now, whereas like it was.
But I wonder if it would have the impact today that it would have then, because here's my, like when I look at history, it's like maybe this is the narrative or the story that we tell, but there are these these movements and one influencing the next, and with art and literature, and when I get to like today, it just feels like the mirror has shattered, and there used to be some kind of coherent narrative, there no longer is. There's like millions of narratives, there's millions of movements, there's millions of artists. I can go on SoundCloud and I can see 10 million new songs, like YouTube, 10 million videos. It's like, there's like, if we were like going to graph like the amount of creative output, all of a sudden it just exploded, right? Because anyone, like you said, you can just publish yourself. I can make this podcast, I can publish it tonight, I can talk to you, I can do this. Like it's like infinite creative potential, but then there's like perhaps less value for the, I don't know, I mean things can still make an impact, but it's harder to make the kind of impact that Kerouac had on a whole culture. Yeah, it's absolutely right. It would not, his book being published now, people would be like, that's not that radical. But maybe because of him, because of what he did.
Yeah, exactly. In the time, in the era, and like, if something that comes out that has the impact that Kerouac did, it would be something that relates to this time and era, that really connects with people in a different way that Kerouac connected to. Because Kerouac, if he was living now, he wouldn't be on the road. It would be whatever book that comes through his experience and expression that is now.
Right. Yeah.
And we're living in a time also where like, as artists, like, because to become an artist back then, you had to really go through the gatekeepers, and you had to get it published by a traditional publishing house in order to
there were more gatekeepers.
Yeah. And you didn't really, there really wasn't self-printing options. You couldn't just go to like a print house. You could probably go to a print shop and just print a few copies. That's how Whitman got his first book, Leaves of Grass, published. Oh, really? Yeah, he just self-published it himself. Oh, wow. He literally put together the entire, all of the letter for letter, because it was letterpress, and so letterpress is you have to like put every piece of every letter, every punctuation, fill it out page by page, and so Whitman hand-lettered it.
That's kind of what I'm thinking about too, like that story of Whitman, or even Kerouac on a typewriter. It took more effort and care to create something, and the ease of modern technology, as beautiful as that is, it's so easy. You kind of like it's like less gravitas. They just put a bunch of words out and post them on Facebook. It's not the same as like carefully stamping it down, like rolling the ink over the paper.
100%. And we're living in this age, which is fascinating, where it's like almost like extra more creativity can come through, but some of it doesn't necessarily have the care that
Right.
some of the other stuff took. And also it's trying to like fight through the noise. That's what I don't like.
Right.
I post my stuff on social, I mean I'm active on somewhat on social media, but I don't like having to try and fight through this noise. Like I'm not trying to be an influencer or, I mean like I'll be like,
You gotta post more topless photos of yourself.
oh yeah. Woo! But I just want to be an artist and post my art. You know, I don't want to have to be like doing all of these other things around that is not me being an artist. But I'm down, you know, have talk about different things and creativity and all the aspects that potentially go along with art.
Yeah.
But I'm not trying to be a, you know.
I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
Cut through the noise, stand out. Like it's like a popularity contest.
Yeah, and there'll be more platforms that come into fruition that are going to be more authentic and actually have algorithms that are designed to support the creators themselves instead of turning us into commodified products to keep us on the page scrolling as much as possible.
Right. I mean, that's another weird thing to think about that's in some sense literally true. If I post to Instagram or Facebook or whatever, in a sense, I'm providing free content. I'm kind of working for Zuckerberg. I'm working for that company.
Yeah.
It's not paying me.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm hoping someone's gonna hit the like button and comment on it. But like, that's my payment, I guess. But like, it's a weird way to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, but it's just accurate
It's
and
true.
true. Yeah, it's 100% true. And so you know, we're living in these strange times, which you know comes back to what Kerouac and Ginsberg and all of them were. And I think if Kerouac were to see what was going on now, he'd be like, he'd
drink even more.
Yeah, he'd be like, you go. I remember in Desolation Angels, it's the After Dharma Bums, and he begins with him doing Firewatch by himself solo on the mountain, I think in either Northern California or Southern Oregon, somewhere in there. But he talks a lot about, even in some of his other books, he doesn't think everybody can be an artist. He's like, not everybody's an artist. Like, I'm an artist, but like not everybody can out there be an artist. Now we're living in a time where like everybody can really put their creative expression out there, which I think I think everybody's an artist, but it's what are you doing to refine your craft so that you become an excellent artist. And it's okay if you don't exactly, and it's okay if you don't want to push yourself to be a fully refined artist, but then don't go out into the world trying to claim that you are that.
Great.
Just be okay that you're an artist and you're just messing around and that's what you want to do, which is totally okay.
The process.
And so it's just about being able to have that self-awareness to recognize what you are, where you are, and what you want to commit to.
Right. Yeah. That's well said.
Yeah, because that's the reason why Ginsberg and Kerouac... Well, I mean, the reason why Ginsberg blew up, he was really committed. Part of what he was doing with the beats, like, he was kind of the person that was like creating this movement and was like pushing all of his friends because once he had access to someone that was like in a publishing position for publishing, he would send all of his friends manuscripts and he's like, hey, check out this, so Ginsberg was like super relentless and Kerouac was relentless just for himself. So Ginsberg was really created this model and this community of supporting to create a movement. And it was in actually the beginning of Dharma Bums where there's this opening scene where they're at a poetry reading, and the poetry reading is at the Six Gallery in San Francisco, and it was a poetry reading that Ginsberg put together himself. I believe Kenneth Rex Roth was the one who kind of pushed him to do it. And so at that reading, there was a gentleman named Lawrence Ferlinghetti in the audience. And Ginsberg, this was the first time Ginsberg ever read Howl publicly. When he wrote Howl, he was not actually writing it to be read. He was writing it for himself as like a cathartic piece, and because the stuff he was writing about was like homosexuality and all these different things that were
taboo subjects.
Yeah, it was illegal to write about. And so when Ferlinghetti heard him read that Howl, he said, "I'm publishing that," and knew it was going to get him into trouble. And so they published it in England, and it was City Lights bookstore, which still exists in San Francisco. But they published it in England because if it was published here, it would have been confiscated.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, but at some point, the people that when it was coming in through England and customs, they opened up a box of it and read through it, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, this is obscene," and so
obscenity laws.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so then the FBI raided City Lights bookstore for selling it. And they took all the books and they arrested the person that was at the counter working. And then it became a huge court case, which Ginsberg ended up winning because on the grounds that the book had academic aspects that were worth of value, and so there was it was considered that it wasn't just obscenity, there was actually cultural value and academic value in it. So it ended up winning the court case, and so that was a huge turning point for anti-censorship and being able to write books as an adult for adults. And so when that won, he became a household name because his name was plastered across all these newspapers on headlines all across the country. Helped
him become famous.
Yeah. If Hal was not attacked by the U.S. government, Ginsberg would have been successful, would have sold some books, but he likely would not be what he is today and become the whole counterculture figure that he grew into.
Right, yeah, that's one of those ironies, right? The attempt at censorship, makes the person more famous.
Yeah.
In that case, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, and it was similar with On the Road wasn't censored because they had because Ferlinghetti was a small press. I mean, Ferlinghetti was just City Lights, they were printing, it was basically self-publishing. And so it didn't have a huge publicity around it.
Right.
But On the Road was the kids just ate it up, and they were all like, "Fuck you, parents!" And they all would show up, someone would show up at Kerouac's house, and they'd be like, "See this old drunk dude," and he'd be like, "Get the fuck out of here!"
Like the angry father figure rejecting the kids.
Yeah, exactly. And the kids are like, "But this is what we want to be just like you," and he's all like,
yeah, I read some stories when he was older, and the Vietnam War was going on, and all the kids, the hippie movement was so against the Vietnam War, and Kerouac was in favor of it and on the more conservative side of his life.
Yeah, he was very much
going against. I guess he just had the sense of going against the grain, and so when he got lumped in that group, he started going against that grain.
Well, I think really what it was is that he had a deep love for what America presents itself as.
He loved America, yeah.
And so when anybody with all of these kids and we're saying these things that were anti-American,
he didn't like
and
that.
so he was like, "But I love America." There's this really famous scene when he met Ken Kesey, when Alan introduced him to Ken Kesey. It was when they were on the bus trip. It was actually on the further bus trip in 1964 when they drove the bus from La Honda, California through the South up to New York. They met, Alan set up a meeting between Kerouac and Kesey, and Kesey was kind of the new hot writer on the block. And when he met him, Kesey was wearing an American flag over his shoulders, and Kerouac just takes the flag off his shoulder, folds it all up, and just sits on the couch and just is grumpy and won't have any dialogue.
Because he was in his mind, disrespecting the flag.
Yeah.
That's amazing, yeah.
Yeah, and Kesey's like, "This is the embodiment of America."
It's so interesting and I think ironic, the hippie movement and the anti-war movement and all that, there's nothing more American than all that now. If you go to another country and talk about America, that's part of what they think of when they think of America. If you go to San Francisco and you see Haight-Ashbury, it's it's like a historical, almost like a museum to that time in history. So it's to me, it's not anti-American at all. It's part of
and I mean, there's always been anti-war protests. Even Civil War, we just don't hear about it. The narrative, they just want us to hear that everybody wants the war to happen. Everybody was pro-war. You don't hear about the anti-war movement of World War II and World War I. The narrative is that everybody was on board with it, and that's how it is, and nobody gets to question it. And I really...
I see that even with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, I participated in anti-war protests.
Me too.
And that's awesome. Yeah. And so I was like a part of this movement. There's literally 100,000 something people in Washington D.C. One time I went right before the Iraq war started, and yet now, like you're saying, like in the media and the kind of history, they're like, America supported the war on terrorism, but now people are questioning. It's like we were questioning that stuff before it even started.
Yeah.
Some people were. A lot of people were.
Well, it's the same thing that was in like that they were dealing with back then. It's they just the media just tells one narrative. Yeah. And they don't like to have an open narrative. And that was a large part of what they were coming up against. And there was a large underground press in the 60s too that was telling an alternative narrative, but we don't really have the historical reference for it much anymore, because it's
good to know that and honor that, because if anything someone criticizes, probably for good reason, about American history, for sure there were some people in this country that were against that thing, right? There were people that were against slavery, there were people that were against the Jim Crow, obviously, like, there's always been the other side.
Yeah, exactly. And I really have it really bothers me that we can't have an open conversation about the issues. Be like, all right, America is, for all intents and purpose, the greatest, most free nation in large nation infrastructures that has ever existed. But indigenous nations had more, they had their own little things, but they didn't have dictators and various different things. They were like, it was Democrats, very much more democratically elected. People knew everybody.
Smaller scale, right?
Yeah. But I think it's really the fact that we can't look at America's past and acknowledge it without feeling like we're saying that we have to destroy America. Like, we can look at it and be like, well, actually, how can we move forward and acknowledge all of the trauma? And like, my parents would sometimes growing up be like, you sound like you hate America. And I was like, just because I'm talking about the things that are major issues doesn't mean I hate America. It just means we have to move forward and have a different America that actually fully embodies the whole representation that is here.
That's the actual real America, is this movement towards greater justice, greater freedom. Like Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech was like challenging us to fulfill the dream of this country. Like, that's the positive vision of our country. I love that. I'm 100% in agreement. I like that.
Exactly, and that's really what all the artists have always been yearning for. They're like, guys, this is not okay. Like, you say you want to represent this freedom, but what is the freedom that you're truly representing? And that's all the beats and that artistic movement that grew into the counterculture of the 60s was really all about, was really trying to have a truly free America. How free is America or anywhere, if you're not able to use psychedelics, cannabis, or various other substances,
It's like cognitive liberty as well. Yeah. Some people I know would talk about it as that could be a part of this movement towards greater freedom.
I think it's vital, and for me that's actually my cornerstone for everywhere in life, is that we have to be able to truly have able to liberate ourselves to explore consciousness by all consensual modalities possible. It's like, as long as it's consensual.
If you're an adult and it's consensual.
There's
a strong argument to be made for that. Just logically, right? Just from in terms of ethics, it doesn't take a genius to figure that out.
Exactly. And and that's the same. I mean, Ginsberg was fighting for cannabis legalization all throughout the 60s and the 70s. He was always doing that and fighting for that, and they were doing mescaline, and Ginsberg was one of the first people to really do LSD and really be speaking about it publicly. And some of the way that the early movements of psychedelia were implemented were not the best. They didn't have necessarily the best support structure around them.
Right. We need to develop better ways, but that would take some intelligence and effort, and it's hard to do if it's illegal and you're being persecuted. And
LSD LSD was legal till 1967.
Right. It's a fascinating history. That'd be a whole nother, probably more than one other podcast.
Yeah, totally.
But just on that note, there's an amazing think it was an interview with one of the guys, I can't remember the name, but he was like kind of the architect for Nixon's war on drugs. And he, towards the end of his life, gave an interview, I think in the 1990s, where he said, you know, of course we knew the drugs weren't really that dangerous, but we were using them to persecute black people and hippies. Like, those were the enemies of Nixon. And so, just amazing how this history repeats itself and how relevant it is, and it keeps... The people who created the war on drugs knew what they were doing. It was political.
Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't a public health thing or something.
Exactly, because they knew that they can't criminalize a group of people. But if you criminalize the actions that a group of people are doing, then you're not criminalizing those people, but they are criminals because of the actions that they're doing.
Yeah, it's a big subject.
Yeah, and that's like how America does its workaround. They go like, oh, well, we're not anti-black people. They just, or like, we're not anti-hippies or whatever. Yeah. And so then they criminalize the thing, and so they're like, well, we're not making laws that are against various different groups, because you can't just outlaw a specific group.
Took a part of the culture and made it illegal, and then that was a way to attack that culture.
Yep.
And hopefully there's a lot of hope. I have a lot of hope in this front. I think we're moving in a good direction. There's a lot of legalization obviously happening, and a huge tidal shift in attitudes around it all. And, hopefully, you know, the sad part is there's still hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people in jail, but tens of thousands of people still being arrested for this kind of stuff, and it's just a tragedy, unnecessary tragedy. I think hopefully it'll change.
Yeah, that's definitely that's part of the reason why I like the name Dank P.H.A.R.T. Why I was able to why I stuck with the name, because of all of that. I was like, this is just insane bullshit, and I have to just exist in a state of insane bullshit to prove your insane bullshit.
Yeah, you know, just real quickly, it makes me like Michael Pollan just came out with a new book. He talks about growing poppy flowers in his garden in the 90s at the height of the war on drugs, and becoming terrified that he might get arrested for growing these like handful of poppy flowers, while at the exact same time in history, whatever it's called, Purdue, whatever, is developing OxyContin and starting to push opioids, prescription pharmaceutical grade opioids on people en masse. And so, like, ironically, the war on drugs is pretty successful at stopping underground heroin stuff. I mean, that's, you know, people still do it obviously, but it was heavily persecuted and heavily cut down and not that easy to find probably. I don't know, but the legal companies were just pushing tons of opium through the legal channels that ended up having tremendous public health consequences. So it's just so ironic. That's a perfect example for why the war on drugs is totally morally bankrupt.
Yeah.
You have a company that made something like $37 billion for the family that started that company.
Yeah, and they recently got exonerated with no
I saw that.
Responsibility for whatsoever. It's just like, oh, that's the company, and we didn't do it.
I think they had to pay $4 billion out of the $37 billion that they made.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
But how many drug dealers are rotting in jail for the rest of their life for selling like $1,000 worth of this?
Or even less.
Or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, I moved out to Colorado the day I got off probation for cannabis in Iowa. And when I was arrested, this was 2009, giving someone a bowl of, just like literally a bowl of cannabis to put in their pipe was considered felony distribution.
Like half a gram or something. Jeez.
Yeah, just like literally not even, just whatever, enough to like stuff in your pipe. And it's not, you could be like consuming it with the person, but you gave it to them to put in the pipe that's in there.
Felony?
Well, that's not how I didn't get busted with that. Like I had like, it was like a couple ounces, like under $1,000. Like, I mean,
so you had your own run-in.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely, doing what they caught me for doing. And I just told them, I said, fine, you caught me. I wasn't doing it for the money. But just even still, like that point that like just giving it to someone, even if it's not for a monetary exchange, is considered felony distribution. In Iowa, I wouldn't be surprised if it was still like the same. But felony distribution. So it's just
the act of giving that's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, crazy. And then all of a sudden you become a felon, and then all of a sudden you lose your rights. You can't gun ownership, ability to vote. All these different things. You pretty much become a second-class citizen as soon as you're a felon. And all of a sudden, then you have to issue getting a job, and you have to go get a job. Are you a felon? Yes.
You have to mark that box.
Yeah.
That's tough.
And then they go, why are you not working? Why don't you get a real job? And you're like, because you made it impossible for me to. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
God, yeah, it's such a big issue, yeah. There was some news article the other day that I saw just kind of randomly that George Floyd, who was killed and all the protests erupted around, 15 or 20 years before that, was arrested for some drug charge in Texas. And then the cop who arrested him and charged him has been found out to be like a crooked cop who's like manufacturing evidence. And so he's posthumously, given a pardon by the Texas government.
Yeah.
But like that, and I don't know all the details of that, but that, it would make sense if like that arrest led him down that road that you're just talking about, where it's hard to get a job and it's all the other negative consequences throughout his life until eventually he's killed by the police.
Yeah, exactly. And then that spiral of depression because you can't get a job, and then you're self-medicating. Yeah. And then you're self-medicating on drugs because you're feeling depressed and you don't have probably the health insurance to get proper access to mental health care, and it just kind of grows. And at every point, he's being extracted upon by the systems that be. Because if he's in prison, there's money getting...
Someone's making money off of him.
Yeah, at every level.
Oh. Yeah.
It's just a giant racket.
It's tragedy.
And like these for-profit prisons, they literally have contracts that say they have to have X amount of percentage of the prison filled at all times. And it's contractually obligated. Yeah.
So they have to put people in the jails that we don't...
Otherwise,
so
it's insane. And that's why the artists do what we did, are breaking out and being like, oh my god, like, what the fuck?
Insanity of our society.
Yeah, and like that's the crucible of whatever's going on alchemically that produced Dank P.H.A.R.T.
Now it all makes sense.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to it than I realized.
Yeah, and it's just a journey, and it's definitely not an easy
one. Well, to come back around to you're coming out with the book, right? Do you want to talk about that?
I've actually got 3 books that I put together, but I'm finally decided to just bite the bullet and use Amazon to print my first book. I actually just got done putting it all together today. It's my first collection of poetry.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. It is titled Broke Past Reason's Border into Fields of Imagination. So it kind of is talking about kind of what we were just talking about, how to break out of this madness, and the whole book is it's a short book of poems, talking about kind of life, this, the insanity of the modern world, trying to reconnect us back to our roots in nature and creativity and magic and psychedelia, and realizing that we can view the world from a different perspective. The final poem is titled Mad Fools Drunk Off Angel Wings, and it came to me in like almost one just complete piece in a sitting at a 2019 Arise at like 3 a.m. I just was like, I have to write this. And it's about these people that are looking at these other people, and they think these people are just crazy. They're building these ships, and they're like, what the fuck are you building? Those ships aren't ever going to go on the ocean. Those are not seaworthy ships. You people are just fucking crazy. And then all of a sudden, the ships start going and raising up to the sky because they were never looking at the sea. It was like the poet's tilted gaze, looking up at the vast blue, just not the sea that most pirates are looking at, and that their giggles fueled the beast, and that they were never even trying to ride the ocean. Their horizons and their visions were set on a total different reality that everybody was just totally ignoring, and then they were able to just transcend it and go off and fly away.
Yeah. Do you want to read something for us?
Yeah.
While you're here? Yeah.
Totally. I've got a couple pieces. None of these are from the book.
Okay.
This one of them is, these 2 pieces. One is a shorter piece. This is not yet in any book, but this will be in a book, and this ties really closely into kind of the beats and into Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, because they were all considered bohemian. And so a lot of the counterculture before it was called counterculture they were called bohemians, which were just kind of freewheeling individuals that would not conform to the standards of society. And back in the urban areas that were called Skid Row were a little bit dangerous, but not nearly what it is now. So you could go live very cheaply and live on the outskirts of society and manage to make it through. But now, like a lot of these urban centers, after 50, 60 plus years of just not having resources invested into them in a holistic way, they've just become much more, unfortunately, dangerous.
Yeah.
Anyways, so this poem is titled Bohemian Christmas. Yuppie wagging overflowing with drugs, but medicine. Wake up so high, not sure how you got in the house. Then realize sun beats upon flesh. No wall contains dreams spilling from muse fountain, untouched by human hands. Genius blinding itself with its own bright flash. Too dumb to see culture stolen. A long conversation that we cannot afford to not have time for.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You want to do one more?
Yeah, I've got one. This is from what will be my second book, titled Heart Revolution. It's titled Relationship Earth. The Earth is our relationship. It is the ship upon which we have our relations. All is relative, born from deep darkness, light playing games in a black box theater, dream world, woven tapestry of eternity. Embrace sacred connection to all. Our mother speaks to us through plants. Spirit guides blind pilgrims through flames. Lay down control. Submit to the divine, activate sacred snakes of spine, flower your love to blossom third pine cone, enter gateless gate, breathe channels open, project into timeless eternity, still here sitting breathing, still here on this relationship. We have to learn to love ourselves, we have to learn to love each other. It is the only way to fit through eye of needle, past self, through self. When we all hold hands, there will be no more walls. Curtains drawn back, wizards shown light, shamans bridge worlds, night will marry day, truth will prowl streets naked, life will be sacred dance to commune with unseen, higher state dimensional highway, road of life paved with fractured truth, ego strings confused syncopated beat, disharmonic frequency, crumble, frail material dreams, poems leap from page to knock an empty notebook open, lines ready to be written, scratched into eternity's tomb, spiritual howls in wilderness, savage ecstasy danced by fire, empty of thought, filled with experience, reflection of mere, held and balanced relation, spun sacred myth on mystic wheels, fingers tap in an empty void, beginning with word, minds got blown, busted soul, expression calls out for love, art is sacred reaching for holy truth, my truth is limitless, it grows with awareness, quit your job, start the real work, go dance like God is watching, it wants to see you naked. Duality split itself upon my razor tongue, life sprung forth from lunatic language, dreams birthed from goddess womb, worm wiggles its way to shake hands with death.
Love that.
Yeah.
I like that one. I felt you on that one. Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Well, it's been great to have you on the podcast.
Yeah.
We could talk forever.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. It's been a wonderful time.
Awesome. I'll have you back on.
Cool.
Do you want to say where people can find you?
Yeah.
I'll link it in the show notes and stuff too.
Totally. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I think also Tumblr, all under Dank P.H.A.R.T, Dank P.H.A.R.T, and my Patreon is also under Dank P.H.A.R.T, Dank P.H.A.R.T, and if you subscribe to my Patreon at the $33 tier, you will receive a monthly NFT package, and NFTs are art tied to the blockchain, making it a tradable and collectible asset. So,
Nice.
yeah.
That's awesome, man. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening. If you've been appreciating this show, please consider supporting us. One of the best ways you can do that is sharing it with social media, with friends and with family, with commenting, with liking the videos, with hitting subscribe on our YouTube channel. Those are all great ways to support this podcast that are totally free to you. And we do have a Patreon page, patreon.com/astateofmind. Every single dollar makes a huge difference. You're welcome to message us as well. Check out our website, astateofmindpodcast.com. We've got some great merchandise, some new t-shirts and stickers and new designs. If you are interested in one of those, just send us a message through the website. Our online store is not up yet. And if you'd like to learn more about my work as a psychotherapist, meditation teacher, coach, speaker, and all that, please visit astateofmindcounseling.org. Thank you so much, and I will see you here next time.